Some of you might remember a couple of years ago, I gave a talk about the old Baptist chapel in Tewkesbury. Well, this talk is getting a bit of feedback here. Can people hear the feedback on the mic?
Just a little bit.
Just a little bit. Some of you might remember that talk, some of you might even been here for that talk, but this talk is a bit more general. So though I will be talking about Baptists in Tewkesbury and obviously referring to our wonderful old Baptist chapel, I will be sort of ranging a bit further and looking more generally at the role of Baptists in the 17th century. Right, an island of the godly, brackets, in a sea of the ungodly. I've called it that because Baptists in the 17th century were slightly under siege for their views, and a lot of them had very exclusive views of their religion, particularly Calvinist Baptists, which we'll talk about later. And I think it's a nice way of sort of looking at this sort of persecuted and often misunderstood group who saw themselves as a little island of the godly in a sea of the ungodly, in the sea of the unbelievers. I'll be referring to that a bit later on. So, 17th century Baptists, the basics. Bear with me for those of you who are Baptists and know all about the Baptist faith, but in the 17th century, Baptists were zealous Protestants who thought that the Reformation had not gone far enough. One could argue that the Elizabethan settlement of the church was a bit of a fudge, okay, though Britain had become an avowedly Protestant country and we'd broken with Rome, there was still a lot of Catholic elements in the church. You still had church hierarchies, you still had bishops, etc. And many zealous Protestants thought they wanted the Reformation to have gone much further. The Reformation was really cut off in its most radical parts. Baptists desired a simpler form of worship based on the Bible, with preaching more important than ceremony. So basically, zealous Protestants like Baptists wanted a simpler form of religion based on how they thought it was originally practiced, and with the Bible as their handbook. And crucially, for the name, rejected infant baptism in favour of adult believers' baptism, crucial to their faith. So that's the basics. So who are the founders of the early Baptist movement? Well, we have two gentlemen. We have this man, John Smith, or John Smythe, 1554 to 1612, and he was a Church of England minister preaching in Lincoln, and he was one of these Protestants who didn't like the more Catholic elements in the church. He didn't like the emphasis on ritual. He certainly didn't like the church hierarchies. And what he does is he takes part of his community, his religious community, over to Holland. Now, Holland at this time is a sort of nice, safe area for people, for radical Protestants. A lot of Protestant groups, sectarian groups met there. And he takes his congregation over there and forms his own community. It's quite interesting reading about this community because a lot of it was quite anarchic. Services, etc., broke down into a lot of debate. But basically, John Smith believed in something I referred to earlier, adult believers' baptism, which was an individual making a statement of belief in Jesus Christ. And arguably, well, not arguably, quite obviously, children are incapable of making that kind of statement, having that kind of faith. So you would have to really be baptized as an adult. And what John Smith does is he baptizes members of his congregation, and he actually re-baptizes himself. Thomas Helwys. Now, Thomas Helwys is arguably the man who really founded the Baptist movement in this country. Now, he was a member of John Smith's church. He was a lawyer by training. And in 1612, he breaks with Smith's church, who he finds a bit anarchic, and brings his followers back to Britain. And it's in 1612 that the first ever Baptist church in this country is founded. It's founded in Spitalfields in London. Now, Thomas Helwys not a huge amount is known about him, but what is known about him is that he publishes this wonderful, a short declarations of the mystery of iniquity. This is a nice quote from it. The king is a mortal man, not God. Therefore he hath no power over the mortal soul of his subjects, to make laws and ordinances for them, and to set spiritual lords over them. You can imagine how this letter addressed to James I goes down. King James I, a devout believer in the divine right of kings, this kind of religious views was certainly not acceptable to him, particularly when Thomas Helwys is actually preaching for independence of all religious faiths. Now, James I wanted a very ordered state church, and unsurprisingly, he throws poor old Thomas Helwys into prison for publishing his short declaration. And Thomas Helwys rather, dies in prison. So the early Baptist movement starts about 1612 in this country. So the Baptist movement, though, is not one movement. It's two, basically. So you have general Baptists in the 17th century, and you also have particular Baptists. Now, Helwys's congregation, they were general Baptists. They appearing about 1612. And they're called general Baptists because they believed in general redemption, universal redemption for all. So this flew in the face of sort of more Calvinistic views of religion, whereby a certain select few are chosen by God from birth to be saved, while others are not. What general Baptists believed in is that you could be saved through good works, through good deeds, rather than just by faith alone. Believed that Christ had died for all mankind, not just a select few. Preached, as I say, a general redemption by good works rather than just by faith or grace. They were anti-clerical and very evangelical, and crucially supported the separation of church and state, which is quite a dangerous philosophy to have in the 17th century when you have the monarch as head of the state church. So if you're a proponent of separating the two, you could arguably be viewed as a form of treason. So by 1626, there were quite a number of general Baptist churches. You have them in Lincoln, Coventry, Salisbury, Tiverton, and London. However, they could really only practice their faith openly abroad. And what we do know about these early Baptist churches is usually from incomplete illegal correspondence and publications. So we have the general Baptists. We also have particular Baptists. Now they come a bit later. They sort of date from the 1640s and particularly blossomed during the Civil War period. And I'll be talking about the Civil War in a few minutes or so. And what particular Baptists did was they embraced a Calvinistic doctrine of predestination, with only a chosen few, the so-called elect, would be saved by God. Quite an exclusive view of a Calvinistic view, but of course Calvinism was followed by many people in this country. There were many good members of the Church of England who were thoroughly Calvinist in their beliefs. They believed in baptism by total immersion, which should actually only be performed by a person professing faith. And they also focused on regional organisation. The whole act of baptism was the idea of washing your whole body in the soul and the blood of Christ and being born anew. And these various regional organisations, you had the Welsh one, the Berkshire one, the Irish one, the Western one, and critically for Tewkesbury, you had the Midlands Association of Baptists. And the Baptist Church in Tewkesbury, they later belong to the Midlands Association. And these association meetings are fascinating. They discussed a whole range of issues pertinent to running the church, to faith, to ideas, etc. And we'll be talking about the Baptist Minute Book for Tewkesbury a bit later, which talks about a lot of their issues. So to summarise, General Baptists were anti-clerical and evangelical, while particular Baptists were always anxious to stress their respectability. Both groups were sometimes called dippers as a sort of way of getting at them because of their belief in baptism. I'd just like to digress for a few moments to have a little word on Anabaptists or rebaptizers, because in the 17th century there's often a lot of confusion about Baptists and Anabaptists. Anabaptists were really largely European-based. The sort of radical Protestant groups, particularly in Germany, sort of Protestant extremists. And what you find is that Boral Baptists in Britain are often called Anabaptists as a term of abuse, as a term of being a religious radical. And indeed, Anabaptists in Europe were quite radical. They declared that the Bible it called for equality of all men, but also of all men and women in matters of the distribution of wealth. So they were quite in favour of communal wealth. And you can imagine how in a hierarchical Europe that went down really quite poorly. Now, Anabaptists had been active in Britain before the General Baptists started, and had been heavily persecuted by the government. Significantly, Anabaptists believed that laws and oaths to the state did not need to be recognised. Only oaths to God were important. And again, in a very hierarchical society, these views were deeply frowned upon. So really the influence of Anabaptists on the Baptist movement in Britain, it's arguable what role they actually had and how important they were. However, evidence suggests that often the relationship between the two groups wasn't particularly good. And in 1624, the 5 existing Baptist churches in London issued an anathema against the Anabaptists, meaning that they were cursed according to the Baptist ecclesiastical authority. During the English Civil War, the term Anabaptist is bandied around quite freely as a term of abuse in the same way that Cavalier and Roundhead were initially terms of abuse, to denote really anyone who is politically subversive. So you often find good Baptists being called Anabaptists. It's very confusing often what group they actually belong to. So talking of the Civil War, Baptists during the Civil Wars, 1642 to 1651. This is a marvellous woodcut, I think, with the Royalist supporters on the left and Parliamentarian supporters on the right. Nice Civil War propaganda woodcut. So taking sides. So as you all probably know, the Civil War had lots of different causes: political, economic, social, etc. But religion was one of the key ones. And in fact, I would argue that religion was probably one of the defining factors in which side you would actually support during the Civil War. And particularly in view of how both groups wanted religion in this country to be practiced. So Charles I and his Royalist supporters wanted a very ordered state church, a very hierarchical state church, where obedience to authority and conformity to rituals and the authority of the minister were crucial. And Charles, like his father, believed in the divine right of kings. He had been appointed directly by God, and the consequence of that belief was that he had the sole right to make laws, and so to oppose him was basically a sin against God. Whereas parliamentarian opponents of Charles I tended to want more independence, not only in politics, but also in religion. and stressed the importance of preaching and understanding the Bible as opposed to just blind conformity to ritual. They were also deeply suspicious of Charles I, because Charles I, horror of horrors, had married Henrietta Maria, who was not only French, but she was also a Catholic. And many of Charles's courtiers were also Catholics. And Charles I is often viewed as this kind of proto-Catholic, but he was actually a good member of the Church of England. However, he was a follower of Jacobus Arminian. He was an Arminian. Now, an Arminian is not to be confused with an Armenian. Jacobus Arminius was a European theologian and was very much anti-Calvinistic. He did not believe, and Charles I didn't believe, that people had been predestined from birth to be saved. They believed, like our early Baptists believed, that people could be saved through good works. Charles I emphasized the beauty of worship. He was very fond of church music, the beautification of churches. He was very fond of the use of surplices for ministers. And a lot of the elements that he favored did smack of Catholicism, particularly his view of having a church altar and having a rail separating the community of religious worshippers from the altar. And this was against what zealous Protestants believed in, where they had a communion table. So Charles I, all the things that he did, all the things that he favoured, though a good member of the Church of England, did smack of Catholicism. And of course, at the time, Catholicism was viewed in Britain as not only as a heresy, but also it was associated with strict government and absolutist monarchy, which was something a lot of people were deeply opposed to. That's Charles I, and that's Arminius himself. So I love this woodcut. This very sums up ideas and views at the time of God, of man, of the devil. So what we have here, I'll get my clicker to work. Anyway, on the left you have of God. So there you have the zealous Puritan holding his Bible, contrasting with the superstitious preached by William Laud in the middle. He's Charles I's Archbishop of Canterbury, and his fellow royalist bishops. Now, William Laud wouldn't have been popular at all with 17th century Baptists. In the 1630s, Charles I ruled without Parliament, and William Laud, as his Archbishop, persecuted Baptists quite heavily. Baptists could be imprisoned, Baptists could be exiled. And this experience of persecution fostered a deep suspicion of both royal power and episcopal power. So when the Civil War broke out, you won't be surprised to know most Baptists supported Parliament, though their allegiance was grounded arguably less on constitutional theory and more on religious self-interest, because Parliament, at least initially, appeared to offer protection against Laudian oppression and the possibility of reforming the English church. However, Baptists didn't always agree with Parliament. They were certainly anti-Presbyterian. Now, Presbyterians in this country, they wanted an ordered state church, but without bishops, but with councils of ministers and elders, etc. And most Presbyterians were Calvinists. So Baptists who weren't particular Baptists, anti-Calvinist Baptists, didn't like the more Presbyterian elements that supported Parliament. Instead, what you find is Baptists in the 17th century align more closely with independence and argued that each congregation had the freedom to worship without interference from ecclesiastical courts and certainly without interference from Archbishop William Laud. So this ideological position meant that during the Civil War, Baptists were both participants in and sort of critics of the parliamentary cause. But crucially, for the development of the Baptist churches, the Civil War and the breakdown of the Church of England actually allowed Baptist churches to flourish. So spreading the word, lay preaching in the army. So unrestrained lay preaching associated with Baptists appears quite early in the parliamentarian army. Indeed, a prime reason for the success and the growth of Baptist churches seems to have been that all sectors of the laity could take an active part in services in the ministry. I say all sectors of the laity, I don't mean women, I'm afraid. I'm afraid ladies could only speak in support of male members of the congregation. So Baptist soldiers, as we'll be looking at later, would often usurp church pulpits to take over and prevent sort of high church ministers from conducting services. And this went down really badly with established members of the Church of England who found it quite repugnant to be lectured, to be preached at by rude, unlettered soldiers. So the new model army created by Parliament proves to be a principal area in which Baptists could extend their influence during the Civil War. Established in 1645, the army was notable for its tolerance of religious diversity and its emphasis on godly discipline rather than just on moral social status. And these features attracted Baptists, many of whom served as soldiers, as some rose to officer rank, and as preachers. I love this picture, ejecting the Antichrist. Now, a lot of Baptists went quite far. I talked about Baptists taking over pulpits. Well, a nice example of this happened in 1646 in June, towards after the Civil War was just winding down, where you have the Oxford Royalist capital taken over by parliamentary forces. And two gentlemen who we're going to be meeting in a bit more detail later, are Colonel John Hewson and his Major Daniel Axtell, arrived at Wallington Church in the city and elbowed the minister out of his pulpit. And they openly defied the law on lay preaching. The following Sunday, they took over they and their men took over the Oxford Church at Aston, which is just outside the city, where they did the same. And Hewson, Colonel Hewson, in his sermon, argues that the hapless incumbent, this poor Church of England minister, was actually an antichrist, which I think is probably a little harsh. But we'll be looking at Hewson and Axtell's roles a little later on. I'm including these people here, Lucy and Colonel John Hutchinson. They were leading parliamentarians and Baptist sympathisers. Initially, even a few parliamentarians were looking a little askance at the way private soldiers were having their own meetings, taking over pulpits, etc. She and her husband were based in Nottingham, and they were observing how Baptist soldiers would gather together separately, separate from the town churches, and would meet in conventicles, their own religious gatherings in their own chambers. However, they both the Hutchinsons soon come to realise that apart from the Baptist wanting to separate from the church, they were otherwise quite inoffensive and very zealous in their religious profession. And at the end, Lucy Hutchinson even outstrips her husband in his arguments, in Baptist arguments against infant baptism. They're both leading parliamentarians, leading kind of Puritan figures. So Baptist churches after the victory of Parliament flourish wherever the army actually establishes itself, for example, at Nottingham and at Hull. And their preaching was a major factor in this. And opponents of Baptists would argue, well, they're just taking over, they're just preaching willy-nilly. But Baptists would argue that because of the breakdown of the established church, there was actually a gap in the market. There was less, the religious services were being cut back, and their lay preaching was actually fulfilling a great need to sort of some religious continuity that had been disrupted by the Civil War. So some Baptists in Parliament's army achieved high office. And here's our old friend, that discoverer of antichrists, John Hewson, from shoemaker to hardline army officer and regicide, a child of wrath. Now he views himself as a child of wrath because under God's judgment, because of our sin, our nature is corrupt to the core. So he's quite hard on himself, quite hard on others. He came from humble origins, like a lot of Baptists did, enlisted quite early in the parliamentarian army, and works his way up to becoming a lieutenant colonel on the formation of the new model army in 1645. And he's one of the signatories on the death warrant of King Charles I. He's in the third column in from the left at the bottom, Colonel John Hewson proudly declaring that the king should die. In fact, he was given the task of actually finding an executioner to behead the king. Post-execution of Charles I, he commands a regiment of Cromwell's troops when they invade Ireland, and he actually establishes a congregation of Baptists in Dublin. And Hewson went on to represent Ireland in the nominated assembly of 1653. He supported the establishment of the Protectorate under Oliver Cromwell, which we'll talk about in a minute, but he definitely opposed Parliament's offer of the crown to Cromwell in 1657. However, he did accept a seat in the newly reformed House of Lords, where he sits as Lord Hewson. Unsurprisingly, come the restoration of Charles II, Hewson flees abroad as one of the regicides, where he disappears from history. We don't actually know his fate. We do know a bit more about his second in command, Daniel Axtell, from apprentice greengrocer to ruthless soldier, Baptist and regicide. So again, he comes from quite humble origins. He was apprenticed to London in 1638 to a greengrocer, and in Southwark he becomes an ardent and very keen member of the local Baptist community there. He joins Parliament's army during the First Civil War, and as I said, was a major in Colonel Hewson's regiment. He has another role to play in the execution of Charles I because he's actually responsible for the security of the king during the king's trial. And again, like Hewson, he goes to Ireland, where he actually becomes notorious for his cruelty against the Irish and particularly against Catholics. At the fall of the Protectorate, like a lot of veterans of the good old cause, he attempts to rally opposition to the restoration of Charles II, but he's finally arraigned for treason for his actions in the trial of the king. And Axtell comes up with the wonderful plea that everybody always comes up with, because I was only obeying orders. So he is actually condemned to death, and he's executed. At his execution, he tells the crowd, "I ventured my life freely for my faith, and now I die for it." Another leading parliamentarian and Baptist figure is Edmund Ludlow, MP, religious radical, Republican and regicide. Now he's slightly higher up the social scale. He comes from a Wiltshire gentry family and enlists very early on in the parliamentarian army. In fact, he's at the first major battle, the Civil War, at Edge Hill in October 1642. Post-Civil War, he's elected as MP for Wiltshire, and he holds strong Baptist religious convictions and works throughout his life for complete separation of church and state. And he emerges as sort of radical independent in the Protectorate Parliament. Again, he's another of the regicides, sits in the trial of Charles I, and is very much in favour of the king's execution. It's a righteous judgment on the king's tyranny. That's how he views it. In 1649, he's appointed to the Council of State, but like Hewson, he bitterly opposes Cromwell's assumption of the role of Lord Protector in 1653. In fact, understanding Ludley, you have to understand not only is he radical in religion, he's very radical in politics. He's an ardent Republican, and he fought in the Civil War for Republican ideals, and he declares that the Protectorate was illegal, and he actually tries to obstruct the proclamation of the Protectorate and refuses to sign it. Again, another person not very popular at the end. When Charles II is restored to power, he has to flee abroad. There's a £300 reward put on his head. He has quite a few adventures in Europe. Eventually ends up in Switzerland, where he's offered protection by the Swiss government. He lives quietly in Vevey for a number of years, but he's always regarded as a potential leader of possible rebellion of the good old cause. He returns briefly to England in 1689 when you've had William and Mary back on the throne, but he's then arrested and attainted as a traitor. Manages to escape, flees back abroad, dies in 1692, so possibly Edmund Ludlow is arguably the last of the regicides. So Baptists during the interregnum, 1649 to 1660, this is the period between reigns when Britain functions without a monarch. So nice flag of the Commonwealth. So England then is a republic. Lots of series of political experiments trying to work out the best way to rule the country without a monarch. And during this sort of period of uncertainty, Baptist churches flourish. They're allowed under the Commonwealth to actually practice religion the way they want it, without the repressive influence of the Church of England. So I think now it's time to mention our friends, the Baptists in Tewkesbury. So Baptists in Tewkesbury left the formal parish church in about the 1650s. And we know what kind of Baptists they were because they were members of the Midlands Association. You might remember me talking about the associations early. Now, these regional associations were only for Calvinist Baptists, not general Baptists. So we believe our Baptists were Calvinist Baptists, particular Baptists. And we're aware of the group thanks to this wonderful resource, the Tewkesbury Baptist Church Minute Book. It's a photograph of it there, which is this wonderful primary source on the Baptist Church. It covers the period 1655 to 1808, and entries in the book are written by ministers and pastors, etc. And it's a wonderful primary resource. The real book itself is in Gloucester Archives, but you can view it in its digitized form on the John Moore Museum website. It's all been digitized, transcribed, etc. It's also available as a touch screen if you visit the Old Baptist Chapel itself. And so it's an invaluable historical resource which gives you an insight into not only individuals, but also into the workings of a Baptist church in the 17th century. So this is a little extract from the minute book showing hostility towards the Church of England. The extract reads, Baptist believers ought not to have the national ministers preach nor join with them in their public worship. When we talk about the national church, we're meaning the Church of England. So Baptists stressed a refusal to hear the Babylonish preachers of the parish, and a withdrawal from the parish church was a mark of their spiritual difference from their neighbours. Like other Baptist separatist churches which split, Baptists wanted, say, a simpler form of church worship that appeared in the New Testament. In particular, they wanted to discard all practices that they didn't actually see in the Bible. And one of those practices was burial. Many Baptists loathed the Church of England's burial service and denied there was any biblical evidence for it being a religious ceremony. So Baptists wanted just a simple burial with just friends and family, no church ministers taking part, just a simple burial, perhaps with some psalms, perhaps with a sermon or so. And the separation of how you're actually buried was a key way of actually separating yourself physically and spiritually from the main church. I think probably there was some practicality to this as well, because if you had a Church of England minister officiating at a burial, you had to pay them. And Baptists deeply resented having to pay any money to the Church of England. So perhaps in Tewkesbury, the most succinct expression of the break with this church was the separation of Anglican and sectarian graveyards after the Civil War. So Baptists probably had their own separate burial ground as early as the 1650s. And that's on the left there, that is the Baptist burial ground, which is next to the old Baptist chapel. Oliver Cromwell. We must have a few words about Oliver Cromwell. He rules England and Ireland and Scotland as Lord Protector between 1653 and 1658, having dissolved Parliament. Now, Cromwell's an interesting figure because he can actually not be identified with any one particular religious sect. He never says exactly what he believes. However, before the Civil War in Parliament, during the Civil War in the army, Oliver Cromwell always champions independence in religion. He's even against a lot of parliamentarian Presbyterians as well. So he wanted an independent form of worship. He wanted religious toleration for Protestant sectarian groups. And the Cromwellian church is actually quite a broad one, and Baptists flourished during Cromwell's protectorate. And Cromwell's religion was firmly biblical, like Baptists, and so the two would sympathize together. For Cromwell, the Bible was crucial. And the Bible for Baptists is really your handbook for life. Practical guidance for the creation of a godly community. So you find Baptist churches, and indeed Cromwell himself, citing scripture regularly in support of their arguments. (1658), Oliver Cromwell dies. That's his funeral banner there, and his regime collapses. And in 1660, you have Charles II coming back to his throne. He's invited back, he becomes head of state, and the years of religious toleration for those who wanted to choose worship outside the Church of England ended. The Cavalier Parliament, 1661 to 1679. With the restoration of Charles II, there's a strong feeling in the country that people want to return to, after the upheavals of the Civil War and the Protectorate, they want to a return to normality. And a lot of the independent sects, Baptists, Quakers, etc., They're seen as being disruptive forces that actually caused the Civil War and enhanced some of its more radical aspects. So they are identified not only with religious radicalism, but also with political radicalism. And Charles's first Parliament supports the revival of a more traditional view, Episcopal Church of England with bishops, etc. Bringing bishops back into the House of Lords, whence they had been removed, and sets about winkling out dissenters from the churches in this country. And the key methods of this winkling out is the Clarendon Code, named after Edward Hyde, the first Earl of Clarendon, who was a key advisor of Charles I and went on to become a key minister for Charles II. And basically, the Clarendon Code are a series of laws to try to cripple the power of dissenters in this country. So in 1661, we have the Corporation Act, which stated that only royalist supporters of the Church of England could hold government office. Interestingly, in Tewkesbury, in the summer of 1662, a commission led by the man on the left, William Herbert, the Lord Lieutenant of Gloucestershire, excludes 12 members of the town's Common Council for being religious dissenters. So the Corporation Act was a way of purging dissenters from all local governments. Then you have the Act of Uniformity, 1662, which says that all who held church office must be appointed by a bishop, and only the 1662 Book of Common Prayer was to be used. The Act showed no concession to dissenting ministers whatsoever, and as a result, about 1,800 church ministers, even if they're supported by their congregations, are thrown out of office. And the Act emphasised that there was only one church in this country with no toleration of alternative forms of belief. And those gentlemen there in the picture there, they are dissenting ministers who gave their last sermons in London before being ousted by the government. Now, the vast majority of Baptists rejected on principle the whole concept of an established church, particularly against having to pay tithes, which is something they now had to do. Worse still, you had the Conventicles Act of 1664, which made it illegal for family gatherings, except for family gatherings, for more than 5 people to hold meetings for religious worship outside the established church. So the Act penalised those who attended meetings, those who preached at meetings, preached at dissenting meetings, and anyone particularly who allowed their building to be used for dissenting meetings. And there was a whole range of punishments that went with these acts. For a first offence, you could be fined £5 or 3 months imprisonment for example, letting your building be used for religious service. Your second offence, you could have a fine of £10 or 6 months imprisonment, while your third offence, where the sent to the assizes for a whopping fine of £100 or 7 years transportation. Now, £5 was probably the average yearly wage for most people, so we're talking about quite large sums of money. Quite interestingly, with a little bit about transportation, one of the places the government wanted to transport Baptists to was to the Americas. And what you find is that the Americas, founded by the founding fathers, etc., founded by people who were fleeing religious persecution, actually was saying, well, no, hold on a minute, actually, we won't accept these people, not because we don't want them, but simply because they're our brothers, and we don't want to inflict this punishment upon them. So transportation didn't really work as a punishment. 1655, at the 5 Mile Act, with dissenting ministers banned from coming within 5 miles of their previous parish. Interesting, the Act also forbids Baptist ministers teaching. It also forbids Baptist ministers taking in lodges, because they're a bit worried that if they're taking in lodges, then they might actually be converting them. They might be working on them. So this stricture is really aimed at discouraging sort of informal learning institutions. So what was the local picture for our Baptists in Tewkesbury at this time? The Restoration didn't meet with universal enthusiasm in Tewkesbury. Quite interestingly, 3 suicides are recorded in the Borough Council Register for 1661 when Charles II returns. Now it's interesting because due to the severe religious prohibitions and property concerns, suicides were very seldom actually mentioned as cause of death. And councils never before recognised death by suicide. And at least one of the suicides that occurs is a man called Francis Godwin, who'd been previously prosecuted as a religious nonconformist. So whether these poor people committed suicides because of the changing religious climate, we don't know, but it's an interesting thing to ponder. So, how was religious conformity tried to be enforced by the state in this post-Restoration? And one of the main ways of enforcing religious conformity was by an episcopal visitation, where your local bishop would come and actually visit. Now, under canon law, a bishop was supposed to visit a congregation in the diocese at least once every 3 years. But needless to say, this visitation process had broken down during the Civil War. So a general fear of sectarian separatist movements, especially Baptists and Quakers, formed the context of the first visitation that Tewkesbury experienced from the Bishop of Gloucester. Now, this visitation takes place between the 19th of December 1661 and the 9th of September 1662. During the visitation, there was no systematic effort to persecute the rank and file of the communities, religious communities. Instead, the prosecutions seemed to have involved separatists known to actually hold religious gatherings in their houses, religious gatherings known as conventicles, which takes us quite nicely back to the Baptist church. There we have the Baptist chapel there. That's 1657. The building that is now the Baptist chapel is listed as a messuage, which is a dwelling house with outbuildings and land assigned to its use. And it's possibly the site of Baptist conventicles, religious gatherings in the 1650s. Because in 1663, a man called Edward Millington of Tewkesbury was presented to the Bishop of Gloucester for keeping a conventicle of Anabaptists in his house. And in a minute book entry dated 28th of June 1663, Edwin Millington is mentioned as being a member of the Baptist Church in Tewkesbury. Interestingly, a year before then, an Edwin Millington had appeared on the deeds of what is now the Baptist Chapel. So it's arguably a reasonable assumption to make that the house being referred to, that he was had up for having a conventicle in, was indeed the old Baptist Chapel. And the Millington family had quite a role in the town. They'd served on the town corporation, but had interestingly been removed at the Restoration. So this is all getting a picture of religious dissenters being persecuted. So we could possibly argue that the Baptist Chapel is being used for meetings in the 1650s. I think it's pretty fair to say that was the building being referred to. So the rank and file offences There are lots of offences that ordinary members of a Baptist congregation could be had up for. They could be prosecuted for non-attendance at the Church of England, for keeping children unbaptized, and interestingly, the community of 135 Baptists in Tewkesbury had at least 17 members presented in court, which is 13% of the total membership. So of 70 presentments made between 1662 and 1665 for violations, 35 offenders can be positively identified as either Baptists or Quakers. That's a rather fearsome Baptist minister there. So Baptists faced persecution from the state. They also faced quite an authoritarian regime from their own fellow Baptists. So at this time in the 17th century, Baptist congregations were typically small and arguably maybe relatively inward-looking, perhaps a result of their persecution. And this introspection, sort of coupled with Calvinistic, sort of self-imposed, exclusivity and persecution from the authorities, often led them to be quite strict with their own members, as was the case for the community of believers in Tewkesbury. Some examples here. So this is another piece from the minute book. It's the second of two pages written in cipher. Pages during the Restoration, a couple of pages are written in cipher. Codes to protect the members of the congregation during a time of persecution. So what we have here is some of the names in the pages have actually been scribbled out as a result of having been excluded from the church. And here on line 3, we have a Francis Walker has been deleted. And later in the book, in the minute book, it's recorded the crimes for which he was excluded. Francis Walker was expelled from the church on the 12th of December 1665 for lying, great stubbornness, suspected fornication, and the casting off of the practice of God's ordinances. Which all sounds quite bad news for Francis for him. So ordinances were the laws and commandments of God. So Francis Walker is excluded. Another minute book page. This refers to an Elizabeth Evans and a Jane Bumpus, who were expelled on the 13th of August 1663. When persecution arose, they departed back again to the world's assemblies and sat down under their ministry, which really is a very long-winded way of saying is they returned to worship at the Church of England. So arguably, some of the authorities' persecution was working. Some of these people are actually returning to the church because they were being persecuted. So in 1670, we have the Second Conventicles Act. Again, a whole list of very prescriptive fines. For your first offence, you could be fined for attending a Baptist meeting. You could be fined 5 shillings. For the second offence, 10 shillings. For the minister, though, £20 and then £40. And this is interesting because it shows that by now the authorities, they're less interested in individuals. They're more interested in people, the ownership, the owners of property, people allowing conventicles to take place, or worse still, preaching at them. And on the right there, you have the fines for allowing a conventicle. So the poor site owner, someone like Edwin Millington, could be fined £20 and then £40. Officials not knowing and acting, a minor official could be fined £5 and a JP £100. Quite large sums. So, by 1672, however, the authorities are starting to rein back a bit on their persecution of dissenters. And Charles II introduces the Declaration of Indulgence, which now requires that meeting places for dissenters and Roman Catholics, they were allowed to meet, but they actually had to be registered by the government. However, many religious dissenters thought, hang on a minute, if we're registering with the government, then perhaps if the political climate changes again, everybody will know who we are and where we're meeting. And unsurprisingly, a lot of dissenting groups actually don't register under the Act of Indulgence. And in fact, the community in Tewkesbury decide not to register. Death of Charles II, you had James II, his brother, who was a devout Roman Catholic, and he was tolerant towards dissenters rather ironically, because he wanted to encourage popular support. In his battle with the Church of England, he thought, oh, dissenters might be a good group we could actually use. Needless to say, a lot of dissenters weren't very keen on supporting a Catholic monarch. So that didn't go down terribly well with them, and certainly didn't help James II keep his throne. Because in 1689, eventually, you have James II's daughter, Mary, and her husband, King William. They're invited to this country. And we have the Glorious Revolution, when Britain, England now returns to being an avowedly Protestant country. And there's a nice little allegorical print there, a satire on the defeat of Catholicism by good old William III. The bottom right of that picture, we have the three little figures. On the left there, we have William III dressed as a Roman soldier. On the right, we have the sinister figure of the Pope. And at the bottom there, we have the female figure representing Albion, representing the country. So we have William defending the country from the wiles of the Pope. (1689), the Act of Toleration, signed by William III, which actually now provides a legal basis for dissenters, including Baptists. And the Act's purpose was to encourage non-conformist groups to support the new regime. And the Act tolerates freedom of worship, however, within quite a lot of restrictions. So toleration, but within bounds. So you had to swear allegiance to the monarchy, you had to reject transubstantiation, you had to register and license your place of worship, and you weren't allowed to have meetings in private houses. Preachers also had to obtain licenses in order to preach. Dissenters still had to pay tithes, boo, they hated paying tithes, and rates to the Church of England. And they were banned from holding public office and also excluded from going to university. So Baptists were still being persecuted, and once again, our Baptists in Tewkesbury don't register under the Act of Toleration. So what was happening in Tewkesbury? Here's this is from the Baptist burial ground. This is the tombstone of Eliza Herring, who was in 1689 was the first recorded minister of the Baptist Church in Tewkesbury. He was a farmer in the nearby village of Apperley, and in 1689 he represents Tewkesbury at the first Baptist National Assembly held in London. In 1690, members of the Tewkesbury Church, then some of them begin to worship in Cheltenham, and Herring would preach at both congregations. And like many Baptists, he believed that the Church of England contained several faults, especially infant baptism, which he considered contrary to the teachings of Christ. He was the minister of the church until his death in April 1694, and so buried in the burial ground by the old Baptist chapel, along with his family. He's succeeded in 1695 by Joseph Price, who comes from the Baptist church in Leominster, who becomes the pastor. And under him, freedom of worship is assured, and the membership of the church grows to about 150 by the 18th century. And it's during this period that the Baptists decide finally to register their church, which takes place in about 1711, is the first recorded use of it, registered use as a place of worship. And it's during that time that the building is converted. So these little two pictures here, they show the building, the exterior, pre-1720 and post-1720. So pre-1720, you have the classic medieval building there, the timber framing, etc. Nice little smoke hood at the top. After sometime post-1720, the whole exterior of the building is rendered, extra door is put in, and these wonderful 18th century windows are also put in. And for those of you who have visited the old Baptist chapel, you'll know that the windows are a real key feature. I believe the whole idea is not only making your building modern, but it's the whole concept of kind of letting the light of the Lord into your place of worship. So a constant affirmation after all these years of repression that they now have a place to meet. The interior at the bottom, pre-1720, classic 3-bay medieval hall house with sleeping accommodation at the two ends, etc. Central hall in the middle. Post-1720, the building is converted. You have a baptistry dug in the floor for your adult baptism. You have the two end bays converted into stalls for balconies, so that religious people can gather up there. You also have on the left of the picture at the top, you have a separate pastor's room created with sliding screens. If you visit the old Baptist chapel today, you can see the pastor's room, a separate addition. Rather confusingly, you have that middle balcony. That actually, we now believe the middle balcony wasn't there in 1720. It was probably 19th century or so. You also have a wonderful, you can't really see it in that picture, a wonderful barrel vaulted ceiling which makes for wonderful acoustics in the building. Unfortunately, it makes for wonderful acoustics, but it makes for architectural nightmare, because when they put in the barrel vaulted ceiling, they sawed in the tithes. They sawed out the ties in the original timber frame roof, and the building started to bow. So those ties had to be put in to hold the building together. So, by the beginning of the 18th century, we have a flourishing Baptist community in Tewkesbury. But as I'm talking about Baptists in the 17th century, that's where I'm going to leave it. So, does anybody have any questions?